Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέσχη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2022. Τελειώνουμε σήμερα το αφιέρωμά μας στις αδερφές Bronte με τα τρία πρώτα κεφάλαια από το μυθιστόρημα The Tenant of Wildfell Hall της Anne Bronte. To J. Halford, Esquire. Dear Halford, when we were together last, you gave me a very particular and interesting account of the most remarkable occurrences of your early life, previous to our acquaintance, and then you requested a return of confidence from me. Not being in a storytelling humour at the time, I declined, under the plea of having nothing to tell and the like shuffling excuses which were regarded as wholly inadmissible by you. Whether you instantly turned the conversation, it was with the air of an uncomplaining but deeply injured man, and your face was overshadowed with a cloud which darkened it to the end of our interview, and for what I know darkens it still, for your letters have ever since been distinguished by a certain dignified, semi-melancholy stiffness and reserve that would have been very affecting if my conscience had accused me of deserving it. Are you not ashamed, old boy, at your age, and when we have known each other so intimately and so long, and when I have already given you so many proofs of frankness and confidence, I never resented your comparative closeness and taciturnity? But there it is, I suppose. You're not naturally communicative, and you thought you had done great things and given an unparalleled proof of friendly confidence on that memorable occasion, which, doubtless, you have sworn shall be the last of the kind, and you deemed that the smallest return I could make for so mighty a favour would be to follow your example without a moment's hesitation. Well, I did not take up my pen to reproach you, nor to defend myself, nor to apologize for past offences, but, if possible, to atone for them. It is a soaking rainy day, the family are absent on a visit, I am alone in my library, and have been looking over certain musty old letters and papers, and musing on past times, so that I am now in a very proper frame of mind for amusing you with an old-world story, and having withdrawn my well-roasted feet from the hobs, wheeled round to the table, and indited the above lines to my crusty old friend, I am about to give him a sketch, no, not a sketch, a full and faithful account of certain circumstances connected with the most important event of my life, previous to my acquaintance with Jack Halford at least. And when you have read it, charge me with ingratitude and unfriendly reserve, if you can. I know you like a long story, and are as great a stickler for particularities and circumstantial details as my grandmother, so I will not spare you. My own patience and leisure shall be my only limits. Among the letters and papers I spoke of, there is a certain faded old journal of mine, which I mention by way of assurance that I have not my memory alone, tenacious as it is, to depend upon. In order that your credulity may not be too severely taxed in following me through the minute details of my narrative, to begin then at once with chapter first, for it shall be a tale of many chapters. Chapter 1. A Discovery. You must go back with me to the autumn of 1827. My father, as you know, was a sort of gentleman farmer in shire, and I, by his express desire, succeeded him in the same quiet occupation, not very willingly, for ambition urged me to higher aims, and self-conceit assured me that, in disregarding its voice, I was burying my talent in the earth and hiding my light under a bushel. My mother had done her utmost to persuade me that I was capable of great achievements, but my father, who thought ambition was the surest road to ruin, and to change but another word for destruction, would listen to no scheme for bettering either my own condition or that of my fellow mortals. He assured me that it was all rubbish, and exhorted me with his dying breath to continue in the good old way, to follow his steps and those of his father before him, and let my highest ambition be to walk honestly through the world, looking neither to the right hand nor to the left, and to transmit the paternal acres to my children in at least as flourishing a condition as he left them to me. Well, an honest and industrious farmer is one of the most useful members of society, and if I devote my talents to the cultivation of my farm and the improvement of agriculture in general, I shall thereby benefit not only my own immediate connections and dependents, but in some degree mankind at large. Hence I shall not have lived in vain. With such reflections as these, I was endeavouring to console myself as I plodded home from the fields one cold, damp, cloudy evening towards the close of October. but the gleam of a bright red fire through the parlour window had more effected cheering my spirits and rebuking my thankless repinings than all the sage reflections and good resolutions I had forced my mind to frame. For I was young then, remember, only 24, and had not acquired half the rule over my own spirit that I now possess, trifling as that may be. However, that haven of bliss must not be entered until I had exchanged my miry boots for a clean pair of shoes, and my rough set out for a respectable coat, and made myself generally presentable before decent society. For my mother, with all her kindness, was vastly particular on certain points. In ascending to my room, I was met upon the stairs by a smart, pretty girl of 19, with a tidy, dumpy figure, a round face, bright, blooming cheeks, glossy, clustering curls, and little merry brown eyes. I need not tell you this was my sister Rose. She is, I know, a comely matron still, and doubtless no less lovely, in your eyes, than on the happy day you first beheld her. Nothing told me then that she, a few years hence, would be the wife of one entirely unknown to me as yet, but destined hereafter to become a closer friend than even herself, more intimate than that unmannerly lad of 17 by whom I was collared in the passage on coming down and well-nigh jerked off my equilibrium, and who, in correction for his impudence, received a resounding whack over the sconce, which, however, sustained no serious injury from the infliction, as besides being more than commonly thick, it was protected by a redundant shock of short, reddish curls that my mother called auburn. On entering the parlour, we found that honoured lady seated in her armchair at the fireside, working away at her knitting, according to her usual custom when she had nothing else to do. She had swept the hearth and made the bright blazing fire for our reception. The servant had just brought in the tea-tray, and Rose was producing the sugar-basin and tea-caddy from the cupboard in the black oak sideboard that shone like polished ebony in the cheerful parlour twilight. "Well, here they both are," cried my mother, looking round upon us without retarding the motion of her nimble fingers and glittering needles. "Now shut the door and come to the fire while Rose gets the tea ready. I am sure you must be starved. And tell me what you've been about all day. I like to know what my children have been about." "I've been breaking in the grey colt, no easy business that, directing the ploughing of the last wheat stubble, for the ploughboy has not the sense to direct himself, and carrying out a plan for the extensive and efficient draining of the low meadow-lands. That's my brave boy. And Fergus, what have you been doing?" "Badger baiting." And here he proceeded to give a particular account of his sport, and the respective traits of prowess evinced by the badger and the dogs, my mother pretending to listen with deep attention and watching his animated countenance with a degree of maternal admiration I thought highly disproportioned to its object. "It's time you should be doing something else, Fergus," said I, as soon as a momentary pause in his narration allowed me to get in a word. "What can I do?" replied he. "My mother won't let me go to sea or enter the army, and I'm determined to do nothing else, except make myself such a nuisance to you all that you will be thankful to get rid of me on any terms." Our parent soothingly stroked his stiff, short curls. He growled and tried to look sulky, and then we all took our seats at the table, in obedience to the thrice-repeated summons of Rose. "Now take your tea," said she, "and I'll tell you what I've been doing. I've been to call on the Wilsons, and it's 1,000 pities you didn't go with me, Gilbert, for Eliza Millward was there." "Well, what of her?" "Oh, nothing. I'm not going to tell you about her, only that she's a nice, amusing little thing when she is in a merry humour, and I shouldn't mind calling her." "Hush, hush, my dear. Your brother has no such idea," whispered my mother earnestly, holding up her finger. "Well," resumed Rose, "I was going to tell you an important piece of news I heard there. I've been bursting with it ever since. You know, it was reported a month ago that somebody was going to take Wildfell Hall, and, what do you think? It has actually been inhabited above a week, and we never knew." "Impossible!" cried my mother. "Preposterous!" shrieked Fergus. "It has indeed, and by a single lady. Good gracious, my dear, the place is in ruins. She has had 2 or 3 rooms made habitable, and there she lives, all alone, except an old woman for a servant." "Oh dear, that spoils it. I'd hoped she was a witch," observed Fergus, while carving his inch-thick slice of bread and butter. "Nonsense, Fergus. But isn't it strange, mamma?" "Strange? I can hardly believe it. But you may believe it, for Jane Wilson has seen her. She went with her mother, who, of course, when she heard of a stranger being in the neighbourhood, would be on pins and needles till she had seen her and got all she could out of her. She's called Mrs. Graham, and she's in mourning, not widow's weeds, but slightish mourning, and she's quite young, they say." not above 5 or 26, but so reserved. They tried all they could to find out who she was and where she came from and all about her, but neither Mrs. Wilson, with her pertinacious and impertinent home thrusts, nor Miss Wilson, with her skillful manoeuvring, could manage to elicit a single satisfactory answer, or even a casual remark or chance expression calculated to allay their curiosity, or throw the faintest ray of light upon her history, circumstances, or connections. Moreover, she was barely civil to them, and evidently better pleased to say good-bye than how do you do. But Eliza Millerwood says her father intends to call upon her soon to offer some pastoral advice, which if his she needs, as though she is known to have entered the neighbourhood early last week, she did not make her appearance at church on Sunday. And she, Eliza, that is, will beg to accompany him, and is sure she can succeed in wheedling something out of her. You know, Gilbert, she can do anything. And we should call some time, mamma. It's only proper, you know. Of course, my dear. Poor thing. How lonely she must feel. And pray be quick about it. And mind you bring me word how much sugar she puts in her tea, and what sort of caps and aprons she wears, and all about it. For I don't know how I can live till I know, said Fergus very gravely. But if he intended the speech to be hailed as a masterstroke of wit, he seemingly failed, for nobody laughed. However, he was not much disconcerted at that. For when he had taken a mouthful of bread and butter and was about to swallow a gulp of tea, the humour of the thing burst upon him with such irresistible force that he was obliged to jump up from the table and rush snorting and choking from the room, and a minute after was heard screaming in fearful agony in the garden. As for me, I was hungry and contented myself with silently demolishing the tea, ham and toast, while my mother and sister went on talking and continued to discuss the apparent or non-apparent circumstances and probable or improbable history of the mysterious lady. But I must confess that after my brother's misadventure, I once or twice raised the cup to my lips and put it down again without daring to taste the contents, lest I should injure my dignity by a similar explosion. The next day, my mother and Rose hastened to pay their compliments to the fair recluse, and came back but little wiser than they went, though my mother declared she did not regret the journey, for if she had not gained much good, she flattered herself she had imparted some, and that was better. She had given some useful advice, which she hoped would not be thrown away. For Mrs. Graham, though she said little to any purpose, and appeared somewhat self-opinionated, seemed not incapable of reflection, though she did not know where she had been all her life, poor thing, for she betrayed a lamentable ignorance on certain points, and had not even the sense to be ashamed of it. On what points, mother? Asked I. On household matters, and all the little niceties of cookery and such things that every lady ought to be familiar with, whether she be required to make a practical use of her knowledge or not. I gave her some useful pieces of information, however, and several excellent receipts to the value of which she evidently could not appreciate, for she begged I would not trouble myself, as she lived in such a plain, quiet way that she was sure she should never make use of them. No matter, my dear, said I, it is what every respectable female ought to know. And besides, though you are alone now, you will not always be so. You have been married, and probably, I might say almost certainly, will be again. You are mistaken there, ma'am, said she, almost haughtily. I am certain I never shall. But I told her I knew better. Some romantic young widow, I suppose, said I, come there to end her days in solitude, and mourn in secret for the dear departed. But it won't last long. No, I think not, observed Rose, for she didn't seem very, very disconsolate after all, and she's excessively pretty, handsome rather. You must see her, Gilbert. You will call her a perfect beauty. You could hardly pretend to discover a resemblance between her and Eliza Millerwood. Well, I can imagine many faces more beautiful than Eliza's, though not more charming. I allow she has small claims to perfection, but then I maintain that if she were more perfect, she would be less interesting. And so you prefer her faults to other people's perfections? Just so, saving my mother's presence. Oh, my dear Gilbert, what nonsense you talk. I know you don't mean it. It's quite out of the question, said my mother, getting up and bustling out of the room under pretence of household business, in order to escape the contradiction that was trembling on my tongue. After that, Rose favoured me with further particulars respecting Mrs. Graham. Her appearance, manners, and dress, and the very furniture of the room she inhabited, were all set before me, with rather more clearness and precision than I cared to see them. But as I was not a very attentive listener, I could not repeat the description if I would. The next day was Saturday, and on Sunday everybody wondered whether or not the fair unknown would profit by the vicar's remonstrance and come to church. I confess I looked with some interest myself towards the old family pew appertaining to Wildfell Hall, where the faded crimson cushions, arid lining, had been unpressed and unrenewed so many years, and the grim escutcheons with their lugubrious borders of rusty black cloth frowned so sternly from the wall above. And there I beheld a tall, ladylike figure, clad in black. Her face was towards me, and there was something in it which, once seen, invited me to look again. Her hair was raven black and disposed in long glossy ringlets, a style of coiffure rather unusual in those days, but always graceful and becoming. Her complexion was clear and pale. Her eyes I could not see, for being bent upon her prayer-book, they were concealed by their drooping lids and long black lashes, but the brows above were expressive and well-defined. The forehead was lofty and intellectual, the nose a perfect aquiline, and the features in general unexceptionable. Only there was a slight hollowness about the cheeks and eyes, and the lips, though finely formed, were a little too thin, a little too firmly compressed, and had something about them that betokened, I thought, no very soft or amiable temper. And I said in my heart, I would rather admire you from this distance, fair lady, than be the partner of your home. Just then she happened to raise her eyes, and they met mine. I did not choose to withdraw my gaze, and she turned again to her book, but with a momentary, indefinable expression of quiet scorn that was inexpressibly provoking to me. She thinks me an impudent puppy, thought I. Humph! She shall change her mind before long, if I think it worth while. But then it flashed upon me that these were very improper thoughts for a place of worship, and that my behaviour on the present occasion was anything but what it ought to be. Previous, however, to directing my mind to the service, I glanced round the church to see if anyone had been observing me. But no, all who were not attending to their prayer books were attending to the strange lady, my good mother and sister among the rest, and Mrs. Wilson and her daughter, and even Eliza Millward was slyly glancing from the corners of her eyes towards the object of general attraction. Then she glanced at me, simpered a little, and blushed, modestly looked at her prayer book, and endeavoured to compose her features. Here I was transgressing again, and this time I was made sensible of it by a sudden dig in the ribs from the elbow of my pert brother. For the present, I could only resent the insult by pressing my foot upon his toes, deferring further vengeance till we got out of church. Now, Halford, before I close this letter, I'll tell you who Eliza Millward was. She was the vicar's younger daughter, and a very engaging little creature, for whom I felt no small degree of partiality, and she knew it, though I had never come to any direct explanation, and had no definite intention of so doing, for my mother, who maintained there was no one good enough for me, within 20 miles round, could not bear the thoughts of my marrying that insignificant little thing who, in addition to her numerous other disqualifications, had not £20 to call her own. Eliza's figure was at once slight and plump, her face small and nearly as round as my sister's, complexion something similar to hers, but more delicate and less decidedly blooming, nose retroussé, features generally irregular, and altogether she was rather charming than pretty. But her eyes, I must not forget those remarkable features, for therein her chief attraction lay, in outward aspect at least. They were long and narrow in shape, the irids black or very dark brown, the expression various and ever-changing, but always either preternaturally, I had almost said diabolically, wicked, or irresistibly bewitching, often both. Her voice was gentle and childish, her tread light and soft as that of a cat, but her manners more frequently resembled those of a pretty, playful kitten, that is now pert and roguish, now timid and demure, according to its own sweet will. Her sister Mary was several years older, several inches taller, and of a larger, coarser build, a plain, quiet, sensible girl, who had patiently nursed their mother through her last long, tedious illness, and been the housekeeper and family drudge from thence to the present time. She was trusted and valued by her father, loved and courted by all dogs, cats, children, and poor people, and slighted and neglected by everybody else. The Reverend Michael Millward himself was a tall, ponderous, elderly gentleman, who placed a shovel hat above his large, square, massive-featured face, carried a stout walking-stick in his hand, and encased his still powerful limbs in knee-breeches and gaiters, or black silk stockings on state occasions. He was a man of fixed principles, strong prejudices, and regular habits. intolerant of dissent in any shape, acting under a firm conviction that his opinions were always right, and whoever differed from them must be either most deplorably ignorant or wilfully blind. In childhood, I'd always been accustomed to regard him with a feeling of reverential awe, but lately, even now, surmounted, for though he had a fatherly kindness for the well-behaved, he was a strict disciplinarian, and had often sternly reproved our juvenile failings and peccadillos, and moreover in those days, whenever he called upon our parents, we had to stand up before him and say our catechism, or repeat "How doth the little busy bee," or some other hymn, or, worse than all, be questioned about his last text and the heads of the discourse, which we never could remember. Sometimes the worthy gentleman would reprove my mother for being overindulgent to her sons, with reference to old Eli, or David and Absalom, which was particularly galling to her feelings, and, very highly as she respected him and all his sayings, I once heard her exclaim, "I wish to goodness he had a son himself. He wouldn't be so ready with his advice to other people then. He'd see what it is to have a couple of boys to keep in order." He had a laudable care for his own bodily health, kept very early hours, regularly took a walk before breakfast, was vastly particular about warm and dry clothing, had never been known to preach a sermon without previously swallowing a raw egg, albeit he was gifted with good lungs and a powerful voice, and was generally extremely particular about what he ate and drank, though by no means abstemious, and having a mode of dietary peculiar to himself, being great despiser of tea and such slops, and a patron of malt liquors, bacon and eggs, ham, hung beef, and other strong meats, which agreed well enough with his digestive organs, and therefore were maintained by him to be good and wholesome for everybody, and confidently recommended to the most delicate convalescents or dyspeptics who, if they failed to derive the promised benefit from his prescriptions, were told it was because they had not persevered, and if they complained of inconvenient results therefrom, were assured it was all fancy. I will just touch upon two other persons whom I have mentioned, and then bring this long letter to a close. These are Mrs. Wilson and her daughter. The former was the widow of a substantial farmer, a narrow-minded, tattling old gossip whose character is not worth describing. She had two sons, Robert, a rough countrified farmer, and Richard, a retiring, studious young man, who was studying the classics with the vicar's assistance, preparing for college with a view to enter the church. Their sister Jane was a young lady of some talents and more ambition. She had, at her own desire, received a regular boarding school education, superior to what any member of the family had obtained before. She had taken the polish well, acquired considerable elegance of manners, quite lost her provincial accent, and could boast of more accomplishments than the vicar's daughters. She was considered a beauty besides, but never for a moment could she number me amongst her admirers. She was about 26, rather tall and very slender. Her hair was neither chestnut nor auburn, but a most decided, bright, light red. Her complexion was remarkably fair and brilliant, her head small, neck long, chin well turned, but very short, lips thin and red, eyes clear hazel, quick and penetrating, but entirely destitute of poetry or feeling. She had, or might have had, many suitors in her own rank of life, but scornfully repulsed or rejected them all, for none but a gentleman could please her refined taste, and none but a rich one could satisfy her soaring ambition. One gentleman there was, from whom she had lately received some rather pointed attentions, and upon whose heart's name and fortune it was whispered she had serious designs. This was Mr. Lawrence, the young squire whose family had formerly occupied Wildfell Hall, but had deserted it some 15 years ago for a more modern and commodious mansion in the neighbouring parish. Now, Hallfoot, I bid you adieu for the present. This is the first instalment of my debt. If the coin suits you, tell me so, and I'll send you the rest at my leisure. If you would rather remain my creditor than stuff your purse with such ungainly heavy pieces, tell me still, and I'll pardon your bad taste, and willingly keep the treasure to myself. Yours immutably, Gilbert Markham. Chapter 2. An Interview. I perceive with joy, my most valued friend, that the cloud of your displeasure has passed away. The light of your countenance blesses me once more, and you desire the continuation of my story. Therefore, without more ado, you shall have it. I think the day I last mentioned was a certain Sunday, the latest in the October of 1827. On the following Tuesday I was out with my dog and gun in pursuit of such game as I could find within the territory of Linden Car. But finding none at all, I turned my arms against the hawks and carrion crows, whose depredations, as I suspected, had deprived me of better prey. To this end, I left the more frequented regions, the wooded valleys, the cornfields, and the meadowlands, and proceeded to mount the steep acclivity of Wildfell, the wildest and the loftiest eminence in our neighbourhood, where, as you ascend, the hedges, as well as the trees, become scanty and stunted, the former at length giving place to rough stone fences, partly greened over with ivy and moss, the latter to larches and Scotch fir trees, or isolated black thorns. The fields, being rough and stony and wholly unfit for the plough, were mostly devoted to the pasturing of sheep and cattle. The soil was thin and poor. Bits of grey rock here and there peeped out from the grassy hillocks. Bilberry plants and heather, relics of more savage wildness, grew under the walls, and in many of the enclosures ragweeds and rushes usurped supremacy over the scanty herbage. But these were not my property. Near the top of this hill, about 2 miles from Lindencar, stood Wildfell Hall, a superannuated mansion of the Elizabethan era, built of dark grey stone, venerable and picturesque to look at, but doubtless cold and gloomy enough to inhabit, with its thick stone mullions and little latticed panes, its time-eaten air-holes, and its too lonely, too unsheltered situation, only shielded from the war of wind and weather by a group of Scotch firs, themselves half blighted with storms, and looking as stern and gloomy as the hall itself. Behind it lay a few desolate fields, and then the brown, heath-clad summit of the hill. Before it, enclosed by stone walls and entered by an iron gate with large balls of grey granite, similar to those which decorated the roof and gables surmounting the gateposts, was a garden, once stocked with such hard plants and flowers as could best brook the soil and climate, and such trees and shrubs as could best endure the gardener's torturing shears and most readily assume the shapes he chose to give them, now having been left so many years, untitled and untrimmed, abandoned to the weeds and the grass, to the frost and the wind, the rain and the drought. It presented a very singular appearance indeed. The close green walls of privet that had bordered the principal walk were 2/3 withered away, and the rest grown beyond all reasonable bounds. The old boxwood swan that sat beside Scraper had lost its neck and half its body. The castellated towers of laurel in the middle of the garden, the gigantic warrior that stood on one side of the gateway, and the lion that guarded the other, were sprouted into such fantastic shapes as resembled nothing either in heaven or earth, or in the waters under the earth. But to my young imagination they presented all of them a goblinish appearance that harmonized well with the ghostly legends and dark traditions our old nurse had told us respecting the haunted hall and its departed occupants. I had succeeded in killing a hawk and 2 crows when I came within sight of the mansion, and then, relinquishing further depredations, I sauntered on to have a look at the old place, and see what changes had been brought in it by its new inhabitant. I did not like to go quite to the front and stare in at the gate, but I paused beside the garden wall and looked, and saw no change, except in one wing, where the broken windows and dilapidated roof had evidently been repaired, and where the thin wreath of smoke was curling up from the stack of chimneys. While I thus stood, leaning on my gun and looking up at the dark gables, sunk in an idle reverie, weaving a tissue of wayward fancies, in which old associations and the fair young hermit, now within those walls, bore a nearly equal part, I heard a slight rustling and scrambling just within the garden, and, glancing in the direction whence the sound proceeded, I beheld a tiny hand elevated above the wall. It clung to the topmost stone, and then another little hand was raised to take a firmer hold, and then appeared a small white forehead, surmounted with wreaths of light brown hair, with a pair of deep blue eyes beneath, and the upper portion of a diminutive ivory nose. The eyes did not notice me, but sparkled with glee on beholding Sancho, my beautiful black and white setter, that was coursing about the field with its muzzle to the ground. The little creature raised its face and called aloud to the dog. The good-natured animal paused, looked up, and wagged his tail, but made no further advances. The child, a little boy apparently about 5 years old, scrambled up to the top of the wall and called again and again, but finding this of no avail, apparently made up his mind, like Mahomet, to go to the mountain, since the mountain would not come to him, and attempted to get over. But a crabbed old cherry-tree that grew hard by caught him by the frock in one of its crooked, scraggy arms that stretched over the wall. In attempting to disengage himself, his foot slipped, and down he tumbled, but not to the earth. The tree still kept him suspended. There was a silent struggle, and then a piercing shriek, but in an instant I had dropped my gun on the grass and caught the little fellow in my arms. I wiped his eyes with his frock, told him he was all right, and called Sancho to pacify him. He was just putting his little hand on the dog's neck and beginning to smile through his tears, when I heard, behind me, a click of the iron gate and a rustle of female garments, and lo, Mrs. Graham darted upon me, her neck uncovered, her black locks streaming in the wind. "Give me the child," she said in a voice scarce louder than a whisper, but with a tone of startling vehemence, and seizing the boy, she snatched him from me as if some dire contamination were in my touch, and then stood with one hand firmly clasping his, the other on his shoulder, fixing upon me her large, luminous, dark eyes, pale, breathless, quivering with agitation. "I was not harming the child, madam," said I, scarce knowing whether to be most astonished or displeased. "He was tumbling off the wall there, and I was so fortunate as to catch him while he hung suspended headlong from that tree, and to prevent I know not what catastrophe." "I beg your pardon, sir," stammered she, suddenly calming down, the light of reason seeming to break upon her beclouded spirit, and a faint blush mantling on her cheek. "I did not know you, and I thought—" She stooped to kiss the child and fondly clasped her arm round his neck. "You thought I was going to kidnap your son, I suppose?" She stroked his head with a half-embarrassed laugh and replied, "I did not know he had attempted to climb the wall. I have the pleasure of addressing Mr. Markham, I believe," she added somewhat abruptly. I bowed, but ventured to ask how she knew me. "Your sister called here a few days ago with Mrs. Markham." "Is the resemblance so strong, then?" I asked in some surprise, and not so greatly flattered at the idea as I ought to have been. "There is a likeness about the eyes and complexion, I think," replied she, somewhat dubiously surveying my face. "And I think I saw you at church on Sunday." I smiled. There was something either in that smile or the recollections it awakened that was particularly displeasing to her, for she suddenly assumed again that proud, chilly look that had so unspeakably roused my corruption at church, a look of repellent scorn, so easily assumed, and so entirely without the least distortion of a single feature, that while there it seemed like the natural expression of the face, and was the more provoking to me, because I could not think it affected. "Good morning, Mr. Markham," said she, and without another word or glance she withdrew with her child into the garden, and I returned home, angry and dissatisfied. I could scarcely tell you why, and therefore will not attempt it. I only stayed to put away my gun and powder-horn, and give some requisite directions to one of the farming men, and then repaired to the vicarage to solace my spirit and soothe my ruffled temper with the company and conversation of Eliza Millward. I found her, as usual, busy with some piece of soft embroidery. The mania for Berlin wools had not yet commenced, while her sister was seated at the chimney-corner with the cat on her knee, mending a heap of stockings. Mary, put them away," Eliza was hastily saying just as I entered the room. "Not I, indeed," was the phlegmatic reply, and my appearance prevented further discussion. "You are so unfortunate, Mr. Markham," observed the younger sister with one of her arch, sidelong glances. "Papa's just gone out into the parish and not likely to be back for an hour." "Never mind, I can manage to spend a few minutes with his daughters, if they'll allow me," said I, bringing a chair to the fire and seating myself therein without waiting to be asked. "Well, if you'll be very good and amusing, we shan't object." "Let your permission be unconditional, pray, for I came not to give pleasure, but to seek it," I answered. However, I thought it but reasonable to make some slight exertion to render my company agreeable. And what little effort I made was apparently pretty successful, for Miss Eliza was never in a better humour. We seemed, indeed, to be mutually pleased with each other, and managed to maintain between us a cheerful and animated, though not very profound, conversation. It was little better than a tete-a-tete, for Miss Millward never opened her lips, except occasionally to correct some random assertion or exaggerated expression of her sister's, and once to ask her to pick up the ball of cotton that had rolled under the table. I did this myself, however, as in duty bound. "Thank you, Mr. Markham," said she, as I presented it to her. "I would have picked it up myself, only I did not want to disturb the cat." "Mary, dear, that won't excuse you in Mr. Markham's eyes," said Eliza. "He hates cats, I dare say, as cordially as he does old maids, like all other gentlemen. Don't you, Mr. Markham?" "I believe it is natural for our unamiable sex to dislike the creatures," replied I, "for you ladies lavish so many caresses upon them." "Bless them, little darlings," cried she in a sudden burst of enthusiasm, turning round and overwhelming her sister's pet with a shower of kisses. "Don't, Eliza," said Miss Millward, somewhat gruffly, as she impatiently pushed her away. But it was time for me to be going. Make what haste I would, I should still be too late for tea, and my mother was the soul of order and punctuality. My fair friend was evidently unwilling to bid me adieu. I tenderly squeezed her little hand at parting, and she repaid me with one of her softest smiles and most bewitching glances. I went home very happy, with a heart brimful of complacency for myself and overflowing with love for Eliza. Chapter 3. A Controversy. 2 days after, Mrs. Graham called at Linton Car, contrary to the expectation of Rose, who entertained an idea that the mysterious occupant of Wildfell Hall would wholly disregard the common observances of civilized life, in which opinion she was supported by the Wilsons, who testified that neither their call nor the Millwoods had been returned as yet. Now, however, the cause of that omission was explained, though not entirely to the satisfaction of Rose. Mrs. Graham had brought her child with her, and on my mother's expressing surprise that he could walk so far, she replied, "It is a long walk for him, but I must have either taken him with me or relinquished the visit altogether, for I never leave him alone, and I think, Mrs. Markham, I must beg you to make my excuses to the Millwoods and Mrs. Wilson when you see them, as I fear I cannot do myself the pleasure of calling upon them till my little Arthur is able to accompany me." "But you have a servant," said Rose. "Could you not leave him with her?" "She has her own occupations to attend to, and besides, she is too old to run after a child, and he is too mercurial to be tied to an elderly woman." "But you left him to come to church." "Yes, once, but I would not have left him for any other purpose, and I think in future I must contrive to bring him with me or stay at home." "Is he so mischievous?" asked my mother, considerably shocked. "No," replied the lady, sadly smiling as she stroked the wavy locks of her son, who was seated on a low stool at her feet. "But he is my only treasure, and I am his only friend, so we don't like to be separated." "But, my dear, I call that doting," said my plain-spoken parent. "You should try to suppress such foolish fondness, as well to save your son from ruin as yourself from ridicule." "Ruin, Mrs. Markham?" "Yes, it is spoiling the child. Even at his age he ought not to be always tied to his mother's apron-string. He should learn to be ashamed of it. Mrs. Markham, I beg you will not say such things in his presence, at least. I trust my son will never be ashamed to love his mother," said Mrs. Graham with a serious energy that startled the company. My mother attempted to appease her by an explanation, but she seemed to think enough had been said on the subject and abruptly turned the conversation. "Just as I thought," said I to myself. "The lady's temper is none of the mildest, notwithstanding her sweet, pale face and lofty brow, where thought and suffering seem equally to have stamped their impress." All this time I was seated at the table on the other side of the room, apparently immersed in the perusal of a volume of the Farmer's Magazine, which I happened to have been reading at the moment of our visitor's arrival, and, not choosing to be over-civil, I had merely bowed as she entered and continued my occupation as before. In a little while, however, I was sensible that someone was approaching me with a light but slow and hesitating tread. It was little Arthur, irresistibly attracted by my dog Sancho, that was lying at my feet. On looking up, I beheld him standing about 2 yards off, with his clear blue eyes wistfully gazing on the dog, transfixed to the spot, not by fear of the animal, but by a timid disinclination to approach its master. A little encouragement, however, induced him to come forward. The child, though shy, was not sullen. In a minute he was kneeling on the carpet, with his arms round Sancho's neck, and in a minute or two more the little fellow was seated on my knee, surveying with eager interest the various specimens of horses, cattle, pigs, and model farms portrayed in the volume before me. I glanced at his mother now and then to see how she relished the new-sprung intimacy, and I saw by the unquiet aspect of her eye that for some reason or other she was uneasy at the child's position. "Arthur," said she at length, "come here. You are troublesome to Mr. Markham. He wishes to read." "By no means, Mrs. Graham. Pray let him stay. I am as much amused as he is," pleaded I, but still, with hand and eye, she silently called him to her side. "No, mamma," said the child. "Let me look at these pictures first, and then I'll come and tell you all about them." "We are going to have a small party on Monday, the 5th of November, said my mother, "and I hope you will not refuse to make one, Mrs. Graham. You can bring your little boy with you, you know. I dare say we shall be able to amuse him, and then you can make your own apologies to the Millards and Wilsons. They will all be here, I expect." "Thank you. I never go to parties." "Oh, but this will be quite a family concern. Early hours and nobody here but ourselves, and just the Millwoods and Wilsons, most of whom you already know, and Mr. Lawrence, your landlord, whom you ought to make acquaintance with." "I do know something of him, but you must excuse me this time, for the evenings now are dark and damp, and Arthur, I fear, is too delicate to risk exposure to their influence with impunity. We must defer the enjoyment of your hospitality till the return of longer days and warmer nights." Rose, now, at a hint from my mother, produced a decanter of wine with accompaniments of glasses and cake from the cupboard under the oak sideboard, and the refreshment was duly presented to the guests. They both partook of the cake, but obstinately refused the wine, in spite of their hostess's hospitable attempts to force it upon them. Arthur, especially, shrank from the ruby nectar as if in terror and disgust, and was ready to cry when urged to take it. "Never mind, Arthur," said his mamma. "Mrs. Markham thinks it will do you good, as you are tired with your walk, but she will not oblige you to take it. I dare say you will do very well without. He detests the very sight of wine," she added, "and the smell of it almost makes him sick. I have been accustomed to make him swallow a little wine or weak spirits and water by way of medicine when he was sick, and in fact I have done what I could to make him hate them." Everybody laughed, except the young widow and her son. "Well, Mrs. Graham," said my mother, wiping the tears of merriment from her bright blue eyes, "well, you surprise me. I really gave you credit for having more sense. The poor child will be the veriest milksop that ever was sopped. Only think what a man you will make of him if you persist in—" "I think it a very excellent plan," interrupted Mrs. Graham with imperturbable gravity. "By that means I hope to save him from one degrading vice at least. I wish I could render the incentives to every other equally innoxious in his case." "But by such means," said I, "you will never render him virtuous. What is it that constitutes virtue, Mrs. Graham? Is it the circumstance of being able and willing to resist temptation, or that of having no temptations to resist? Is he a strong man that overcomes great obstacles and performs surprising achievements, though by dint of great muscular exertion and at the risk of some subsequent fatigue, or he that sits in his chair all day with nothing to do more laborious than stirring the fire and carrying his food to his mouth? If you would have your son to walk honourably through the world, you must not attempt to clear the stones from his path, but teach him to walk firmly over them, not insist upon leading him by the hand, but let him learn to go alone. I will lead him by the hand, Mr. Markham, till he has strength to go alone, and I will clear as many stones from his path as I can, and teach him to avoid the rest, or walk firmly over them, as you say. For when I have done my utmost in the way of clearance, there will still be plenty left to exercise all the agility, steadiness, and circumspection he will ever have. It is all very well to talk about noble resistance and trials of virtue, but for 50 or 500 men that have yielded to temptation, show me one that has had virtue to resist. And why should I take it for granted that my son will be 1 in 1,000? And not rather prepare for the worst, and suppose he will be like the rest of mankind, unless I take care to prevent it? "You are very complimentary to us all," I observed. "I know nothing about you. I speak of those I do know, and when I see the whole race of mankind, with a few rare exceptions, stumbling and blundering along the path of life, sinking into every pitfall and breaking their shins over every impediment that lies in their way, shall I not use all the means in my power to ensure for him a smoother and a safer passage? Yes, but the surest means will be to endeavour to fortify him against temptation, not to remove it out of his way." "I will do both, Mr. Markham. God knows he will have temptations enough to assail him, but from within and without, when I have done all I can to render vice as uninviting to him as it is abominable in its own nature, I myself have had, indeed, but few incentives to what the world calls vice, but yet I have experienced temptations and trials of another kind, that have required, on many occasions, more watchfulness and firmness to resist than I have hitherto been able to muster against them. And this, I believe, is what most others would acknowledge, who are accustomed to reflection and wishful to strive against their natural corruptions." "Yes," said my mother, but half apprehending her drift, "but you would not judge of a boy by yourself. And, my dear Mrs. Graham, let me warn you in good time against the error, the fatal error, I may call it, of taking that boy's education upon yourself. Because you are clever in some things and well informed, you may fancy yourself equal to the task, but indeed you are not. And if you persist in that attempt, believe me, you will bitterly repent it when the mischief is done. I am to send him to school, I suppose, to learn to despise his mother's authority and affection," said the lady with a rather bitter smile. "Oh no, but if you would have a boy to despise his mother, let her keep him at home and spend her life in petting him up and slaving to indulge his follies and caprices." "I perfectly agree with you, Mrs. Markham, but nothing can be further from my principles and practice than such criminal weakness as that." "Well, but you will treat him like a girl. You'll spoil his spirit and make a mere Miss Nancy of him. You will indeed, Mrs. Graham, whatever you may think. But I'll get Mr. Millwood to talk to you about it. He'll tell you the consequences. He'll set it before you as plain as the day. and tell you what you ought to do and all about it, and I don't doubt he'll be able to convince you in a minute." "No occasion to trouble the vicar," said Mrs. Graham, glancing at me. I suppose I was smiling at my mother's unbounded confidence in that worthy gentleman. "Mr. Markham here thinks his powers of conviction at least equal to Mr. Millwood's. If I hear not him, neither should I be convinced, though one rose from the dead, he would tell you. Well, Mr. Markham, you that maintain that the boy should not be shielded from evil, but sent out to battle against it, alone and unassisted, not taught to avoid the snares of life, but boldly to rush into them or over them as he may, to seek danger rather than shun it, and feed his virtue by temptation, would you— I beg your pardon, Mrs. Graham, but you get on too fast. I have not yet said that the boy should be taught to rush into the snares of life, or even wilfully to seek temptation for the sake of exercising his virtue by overcoming it. I only say that it is better to arm and strengthen your hero than to disarm and enfeeble the foe. And if you were to rear an oak sapling in a hothouse, tending it carefully night and day, and shielding it from every breath of wind, you could not expect it to become a hardy tree, like that which has grown up on the mountain-side, exposed to all the action of the elements, and not even sheltered from the shock of the tempest. Granted. But would you use the same argument with regard to a girl? Certainly not. No. You would have her to be tenderly and delicately nurtured, like a hothouse plant, taught to cling to others for direction and support, and guarded as much as possible from the very knowledge of evil. But will you be so good as to inform me why you make this distinction? Is it that you think she has no virtue? Assuredly not. Well, but you affirm that virtue is only elicited by temptation, and you think that a woman cannot be too little exposed to temptation, or too little acquainted with vice, or anything connected therewith. It must be either that you think she is essentially so vicious or so feeble-minded that she cannot withstand temptation, and though she may be pure and innocent as long as she is kept in ignorance and restraint, yet, being destitute of real virtue, to teach her how to sin, is it at once to make her a sinner, and the greater her knowledge, the wider her liberty, the deeper will be her depravity, whereas in the nobler sex there is a natural tendency to goodness, guarded by a superior fortitude, which the more it is exercised by trials and dangers, is only the further developed. Heaven forbid that I should think so, I interrupted at last. Well then, it must be that you think they are both weak and prone to err, and the slightest error, the merest shadow of pollution, will ruin the one, while the character of the other will be strengthened and embellished, his education properly finished by a little practical acquaintance with forbidden things. Such experience, to him, to use a trite simile, will be like the storm to the oak, which, though it may scatter the leaves and snap the smaller branches, serves but to rivet the roots, and to harden and condense the fibres of the tree. You would have us encourage our sons to prove all things by their own experience, while our daughters must not even profit by the experience of others. Now I would have both so to benefit by the experience of others, and the precepts of a higher authority, that they should know beforehand to refuse the evil and choose the good, and require no experimental proofs to teach them the evil of transgression. I would not send a poor girl into the world unarmed against her foes and ignorant of the snares that beset her path. Nor would I watch and guard her till, deprived of self-respect and self-reliance, she lost the power or the will to watch and guard herself. And as for my son, if I thought he would grow up to be what you call a man of the world, one that has seen life and glories in his experience, even though he should so far profit by it as to sober down at length into a useful and respected member of society, I would rather that he died tomorrow, rather 1,000 times, she earnestly repeated, pressing her darling to her side and kissing his forehead with intense affection. He had already left his new companion and been standing for some time beside his mother's knee, looking up into her face and listening in silent wonder to her incomprehensible discourse. "Well, you ladies must always have the last word, I suppose," said I, observing her rise and begin to take leave of my mother. "You may have as many words as you please, only I can't stay to hear them. No, that is the way. You hear just as much of an argument as you please, and the rest may be spoken to the wind. If you are anxious to say anything more on the subject," replied she, as she shook hands with Rose, "you must bring your sister to see me some fine day, and I'll listen, as patiently as you could wish, to whatever you please to say. I would rather be lectured by you than the vicar, because I should have less remorse in telling you, at the end of the discourse, that I preserve my own opinion precisely the same as at the beginning, as would be the case, I am persuaded, with regard to either logician." Yes, of course, replied I, determined to be as provoking as herself. For when a lady does consent to listen to an argument against her own opinions, she is always predetermined to withstand it, to listen only with her bodily ears, keeping the mental organs resolutely closed against the strongest reasoning. Good morning, Mr. Markham, said my fair antagonist with a pitying smile, and deigning no further rejoinder, she slightly bowed and was about to withdraw. But her son, with childish impertinence, arrested her by exclaiming, Mamma, you have not shaken hands with Mr. Markham. She laughingly turned around and held out her hand. I gave it a spiteful squeeze, for I was annoyed at the continual injustice she had done me from the very dawn of our acquaintance. Without knowing anything about my real disposition and principles, she was evidently prejudiced against me, and seemed bent upon showing me that her opinions respecting me, on every particular, fell far below those I entertained of myself. I was naturally touchy, or it would not have vexed me so much. Perhaps, too, I was a little bit spoiled by my mother and sister, and some other ladies of my acquaintance, and yet I was by no means a fop. Of that I am fully convinced, whether you are or not. Calovrat.